Good morning, everyone. Bon matin à tous. Welcome to this morning's Recovery Road Economic Series, Chemin de la Reprise, presented by the Chamber of Commerce for Greater Moncton. My name is John Wishart. I'm CEO of the Chamber, and I will be your host and moderator of today's presentation. I want to thank you for tuning in with us this morning. Welcome to Phase 2 of Green. We're all a little bit more optimistic than the day before. Before we get started, I want to thank our sponsors for the Recovery Road series, Commercial Properties, Inc., CPA New Brunswick, Liberty Utilities, and Wilson Insurance. This series is an extension of our successful Recovery Road Summit that we staged in February. L'objectif est de présenter des webinaires qui aideront les leaders du monde des affaires comme vous à émerger de la COVID-19 plus fort et mieux préparé pour une reprise économique complete. So before introducing our guest speakers, I want to let everyone know that you can post a question at any time during the presentation using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we'll get to as many questions as time allows at the end of the presentation. So today's topic is all about working with government. And I know after the last 15 months, you may think you've had enough of government, but if anything, our experience as business leaders and not-for-profit leaders has shown we need to be razor sharp in how we deal with, engage, and lobby government, especially in times of crisis, and also in better times. So to many in the private sector, government is a kind of enigma. And to many in the public sector, finding private sector consultants who understand how government works is a bit of a struggle. And this webinar explains the structure and decision-making process of government, as well as the role of lobbyists in influencing government decisions. So we're very pleased to have with us this morning one half of Porter O'Brien. We had originally planned to have both halves of this public relations and government relations firm, but unfortunately, Tim Porter isn't available this morning. But we are very happy, however, to introduce Jordan O'Brien. Jordan has worked for over 20 years in the area of government affairs, communications, and management strategy. And after a 10-year career with the provincial government, he started a private consulting practice, which has included serving as co-founder and partner at Porter O'Brien, a Fredericton-based communications and management consulting agency. Jordan is a member of the board of directors of the Fredericton Chamber of Commerce. So good to hear that, Jordan. The Mackenzie Institute, a national think tank and charity that focuses on security issues, and the Fredericton Regional Youth Services, Inc., an operator of facilities that provide therapeutic services for youth experiencing social, emotional, and behavioral challenges. And except for a stint of several years in Ottawa, Jordan has resided in Fredericton since 1999. I should point out that Porter O'Brien now also has a Moncton-based consultant, Julie Robichaud, who also has an extensive government experience record. Also joining Jordan today is Jordan's colleague, Christine McGrath, who I had the pleasure of meeting a couple weeks ago. So with those intros, it's now my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Jordan. Jordan?
Merci, très bien, John, and thank you, everyone. That's a great introduction. It was a little Fredericton heavy, I guess, but as John mentions, we are members of the Moncton Chamber as well, and do a lot of business down there, and hope to do more as time goes on. Maybe see some of you in the Moncton Chamber golf tournament in August, which we'll be participating in. Je vais dérouler ma présentation principalement en anglais, mais certainement, je suis content de répondre à vos questions dans la langue de votre choix. Et donc, je vais commencer, and I want to apologize in advance. I'm a bit of a nerd, and this may be a bit boring, and I'm going to do my best to avoid that. But it is somewhat boring subject matter, although at the end of the day, as John mentions, we all do need to deal with government, sometimes perhaps more than we would like, but it's a necessary evil, I suppose. So who is Porter O'Brien? As John described, Tim Porter and Jordan O'Brien, that being me, founded this company in 2019. but it's much broader than just the two of us. We have a network of associates around the province. As John mentions, Julie is based in Moncton. We have people in other parts of New Brunswick that are full-time employees, but we also have a lot of associates that we work with all over Atlantic Canada and in Upper Canada as well. Tim comes from media, and I pass on his regrets. He had planned to be here today as a bit of a health issue he's dealing with, unfortunately, this week, and can't be here. But he spent 20 years in government after a career in media where he would have known John, and worked in communications, but he also spent 5 years in Halifax with the Council of Atlantic Premiers, which gives him a very interesting perspective into all of the Atlantic provinces and how they work. My background is more in government and politics and the private sector and in the political sector. I was in Ottawa for 5 years, as John mentioned, and then I came back to New Brunswick and spent 10 years with the provincial government, ending as Deputy Minister to the Premier, and left government in late 2018 when the government changed. Not coincidentally, that's the nature of that kind of a political job. And get into consulting, and about a year after that, Tim and I started this company. So today I'm going to go over kind of a bit of a government 101, and frankly, most of these bullets could fall under government 101, but the nature of our system, it's very different. The Canadian British system is a system of evolution as opposed to revolution. We have slowly became what we are today, as opposed to a fairly radical snap from one system to another, like we've seen in the United States and some other places in the world. We have three branches of government. That's kind of basic political science. I'll talk about those and the different aspects of those and how that might impact a business that wants to influence government. And then I'll talk about stakeholders and lobbyists, which is, I suppose, what all of us would be. And then I'd be happy to take any questions about it. So Government 101, Canada is a constitutional monarchy. The Queen is not just the Queen of England, she's also the Queen of Canada. All of the power of government more or less rests in the Crown. And so that's why you hear about the Crown all the time. If you're a bad person and you go to jail, and you're charged with a crime, and when you get to court, it's the Crown versus you. And that's because the Crown is the embodiment of the government. And the executive in particular is people who are executing on that power of the Crown. So you have the Premier, Prime Minister, ministers, but also, police officers, project managers, whoever. Those are all the executive branch. They're all exercising the Crown's power. And you have the legislative branch, which is MLAs or MPs, senators in the federal system. They kind of set the rules and the framework. So nothing that the executive does can happen without there being some rules from the legislative branch. And that includes laws that say, okay, you can do this, you can't do that, but also the budgets that they function under. Only money can only be spent. Taxes can only be collected by legislative decree. And then the judicial branch is a little more arm's length. It's, as of course, the courts, and they interpret laws and that sort of thing. We don't influence the judges very much. They're a few steps removed. So evolution, not revolution. I can go back further than 1215 with the Magna Carta, but I'll start there. The Magna Carta, most people have heard of, not a lot of people are familiar with, but the Magna Carta would be Latin for Great Charter, and that was a document signed when a bunch of noblemen thought that the king was out of order, and they said, look, we're not going to do anything you want, we're going to do that within a framework of things. And that was kind of the first document that constrained the power of the Crown. When we speak about evolution, not revolution, the irony of the Glorious Revolution, which is a big watershed moment in the history of the British system that we live under, was the one time there was a revolution. They kind of undid it after a few decades, and they called the restoration of normalcy, revolution. And so the crown had been overthrown, and there was more or less a dictatorship running England for a couple of decades. And then when the crown was restored, that was called the Glorious Revolution. It's kind of ironic that undoing some change was called a revolution. Excuse me. And then responsible government. A lot of us hear about responsible government, but the notion that the crown's ministers would be people who are answerable to the public through Parliament, and they would therefore have to have confidence of the House. That notion is called responsible government, that we all know very well now, but that was a new concept that gradually came into place in the 1800s. And then here in Canada, a fun question is, when did Canada become a country? That sounds like a simple question, but it's not. So of course, 1867 is a date that some might cite. But at that time, we had no foreign minister. We had no control over foreign affairs. We couldn't sign treaties. We had no citizenship, etc. So slowly over time, in 1931, I believe the Statute of Westminster gave us kind of control over our foreign affairs. 1947, Canadian citizenship became a thing. 1982, we got the control over our constitution, which previous to that could only be changed with the consent of the British Parliament. So when we talk about evolution, the system is a slow-moving thing that changes over time as opposed to a radical change. So I talked before about the three branches of government. Again, I apologize for the dryness of this. Usually there's some back and forth, but I missed my partner today. But the legislative branch, as I mentioned, sets the rules. They set the laws, they set the taxes, and they set the budgets. Federally, we've got two bodies in that legislative branch, the House of Commons and the Senate. And the Senate is becoming a much more important thing. If you had a big federal lobbying task to do, the Senate would probably be part of that, much more so today than it might have been 10 years ago. And that's because the Trudeau government over the last 6 years has had this initiative to, I wouldn't say democratize, but legitimize, I guess, the Senate with an independent appointment process. And instead of the Mike Duffys of the world being appointed to the Senate, we have, leaders in their fields and so forth that are chosen through a process that has resulted in senators who kind of feel a little bit more legitimate, a little less beholden to the political structure. And the Senate has almost as much power as the House of Commons, but traditionally they haven't really exercised that power because they didn't feel that they had the moral authority to do so, and now they kind of do. So the Senate plays a much bigger role than it did even a few years ago, and that can be something that you need to pursue. Provincially, it's what we call a unicameral legislature, which is one house. Interestingly enough, in the past, we did have two, and all the provinces did. Those upper houses were abolished over time, and so we have that one house. And then secondary legislation is a political science term, legal term that a lot of people aren't familiar with, but that is what's commonly known as regulations. And regulations have the same authority as legislation. The difference is that only the legislature can pass legislation, but the executive, which is ministers, cabinet, can make regulations, secondary legislation. But all that they can do in that context are things that legislation lets them do. So any particular act would say all the different rules would be spelled out, and then they would go on to say, oh, and the Lieutenant Governor and Council, which is cabinet, can make regulations in the following areas. And so you can't make regulations without a legislative primary legislation that says you can. But a great deal of authority is invested in the executive branch in various pieces of legislation that give them the power to regulate. The executive branch, which is essentially cabinet, administers the rules within that context that's granted by the legislature. So they can't do really anything that the legislature has not put into a law at some point that says they can do. The system of responsible government we talked about, so the cabinet must be accountable to the legislature, must enjoy its confidence, creates an unusual system from a political science perspective. In the United States, the president and the cabinet is completely separate from the Congress. Here, it's the difference. We have the premier and all the ministers sit in the legislative branch, but in their ministerial role, they're separate from the legislative branch, so that can become a little bit confusing. Secondary legislation or regulations, as I talked about before, falls under that executive branch. The Crown, everything is done in the name of the Crown, as I talked about earlier, but the Crown has reserve powers. So we saw that a little bit here in New Brunswick a few years ago when everybody was running to Government House after the 2018 election about who might form the government when there was a minority. And that's one of the few powers that the Crown retains, and it's the fundamental kind of value of the monarchy in our system, is that the Crown is kind of a arm's length referee, that when things get to the point of non-clarity, the Crown can intervene. And minority government's a great example of that. The Crown is a person that can come in and choose, and the Crown might be the Queen, or might be the Governor General, or it might be the Lieutenant Governor, but the Crown can come in a non-partisan, non-biased way, help navigate those sorts of systems, and that's the most important role of the Crown in our system. Within that executive branch, you have ministers that are literally the executive, but then there's deputy ministers. Many of you may have dealt with or met with deputy ministers. And then there's the clerk. Not a lot of people deal with the clerk. And so ministers are obviously politicians. But deputy ministers, like ministers, report to the premier through the clerk. And so deputy ministers are not reporting to their ministers. And so you get an interesting push and pull there, where deputy ministers are not report to the Minister of Health, very strongly supported by the Deputy Minister of Health. The Deputy Minister of Health is not the number two to the Minister of Health in a reporting sense. All deputy ministers are appointed by the Premier. And so there's an unusual kind of push and pull that comes from that. Ministers are kind of responsible for policy and strategy and kind of the vision, but deputy ministers are the CEOs of their departments, and they have to run those departments day to day on their own, and they answer to the center, to the premier, for that work. And so the clerk is the senior civil servant, the boss of all the deputy ministers, and that's a position that isn't super well known by the general public, but it's very, very important. It's a deputy minister level position, but it's the person that kind of runs the government behind the scenes, and that all those deputy ministers, on paper, they report to the premier, but in practice, they report through the clerk to the premier. And that exists federally as well. It's a system that exists throughout Westminster governments all over the world. Of course, you've got the prime minister or the premier, who is the executor of a lot of authority. The cabinet and cabinet committees have a lot of power as well. So it's not just a cabinet that makes a lot of decisions, but there are subcommittees of that cabinet, which sometimes can execute a lot of authority. And then you have political staff, which are ministers have EAs. The premier has a big entourage as well. And ministers, deputy ministers, and political staff, a lot of their power, a lot of their authority is whatever the premier is giving them, or the prime minister in the federal context, the authority to do. And it can be a lot, and often it is. And so when you're trying to influence government, it may be political staffers, it may be deputy ministers, it may be the clerk that you really want to talk to more so than the ministers, even though the ministers are the face of it. The judicial branch, I won't spend a lot of time on. They interpret the rules within the confines of the Constitution. Our Constitution is both written and unwritten, which is a whole lesson in political science in and of itself. But the provincial and federal courts exist. There's a hierarchy of these courts. There are appeals that you can make. Reference cases are an interesting thing. It's relatively unique to Canada, where governments can go to the courts without any kind of legal action and say, hey, court, can you tell me what I'm allowed to do here? That might be something that you might want to influence in a certain context if that were going to occur. But as a general rule, we don't attempt to influence the judicial branch, lobby the judicial branch, etc., because that would be considered a bit of a no-no, and the judges generally wouldn't have any time for that anyway. Excuse me. So stakeholders, we talk a lot about stakeholders. The notion of the importance of stakeholders is more and more all the time. There's a context or a concept of consent of the governed, which we see more and more now in the later years of where governments win elections. And we always used to hear the concept, well, you get a 4-year mandate, put it to use. So people would really consult people every 4 years, and in between they more or less do what they wanted. Now there's a concept that is got more currency of the consent of the governed, which suggests that governments must check in with the public regularly. We have a reactive versus proactive engagement. So sometimes governments will go out on their own and consult people and try to build a consensus before they come forward with a policy issue. The current government is doing that to some extent right now on local government reform. And then you have reactive engagement, where government kind of trips up and has done something that's not very popular. There's a bit of a reaction, and then they engage after the original move. And those two kinds of engagement can come in different forms, obviously, because one is designed and the other is panic driven. We have formal and informal stakeholders. So there's associations like the Chamber of Commerce of Greater Moncton, for example, who would probably regularly be consulted by government on things, or hopefully would be. And then you have more informal stakeholder groups where there might be some ad hoc group that's coming together, like the Save Our School group, and there's one of those in Moncton right now in the Bessborough school situation. That those kind of groups just trying to come together because of a particular issue. And then there's what we call public education in government, which is when you try to go out and convince the public of the merits of something that government's up to, which is a kind of a one-way form of stakeholder engagement where government kind of pushes its message out to try to convince people or to minimize the negative reaction from people. Social media is a huge part of stakeholder engagement now. We all see that every day, but groups get formed on Facebook, hashtags appear on Twitter, etc., and people can kind of come together to express their voice. More of a grassroots organizations can form quite quickly because of social media, which really changes the way government deals with stakeholders in the public. And then there are lobbyists, and lobbyists can be a bit of a dirty word, but I'll speak about lobbyists here on this next slide. It's interesting in that a lot of people don't realize that they are, as far as the law is concerned, lobbyists. And that is that the law is very, very broad in the way it defines what lobbyists are. And a lot of our understanding as general public people about lobbying is an American concept of it, which comes from, we all watch American TV, American movies, etc. But that's not really how it works. And I can tell you a funny story. When I lived in Ottawa and I worked for a lobbying firm, we had an American client, and we dealt primarily with the local folks based in Canada. But when we signed up to be their lobbyist, we had to obviously sign an agreement with them to determine what our role would be. And I was dealing with their legal people in their head office in Florida. And they sent what was their standard lobbying contract, which was over 60 pages in length. It included provisions such as you must carry lobbyist insurance, which doesn't even exist in this country. And so I went back to the guy and I said, look, here's our standard contract, which is 3 pages. Maybe we can meet in the middle. And this is all by email, a few hours later, my phone rings and the guy says, look, I've reviewed your contract and I've reviewed Canada's Lobbyist Registration Act, and I'm a little confused. I said, well, let me try to help you out. He said, well, what is it that you're going to do for us? Because as far as I can tell, lobbying is illegal in Canada. And that's actually true. What Americans would consider lobbying is not legal in Canada. There's lots of rules. It's very, very much reduced in terms of any kind of influence peddling you can do, any kind of work you can do in that regard. And so I'll talk about what we do, but lobby is a very broad definition. So in New Brunswick, the Act calls lobbying anybody who communicates with a public officer in an attempt to influence. So, you pick up the phone and call, a mid-level bureaucrat and say, look, I really would like to get some money from this program that you've announced. So I'm going to fill out an application, but I just want to talk to you about how I can make that a real strong application to make sure I have a good chance. You're a lobbyist, and technically you have to register under the law. Federally, it's even broader than that. In New Brunswick, you have to have an attempt to influence. And federally, if you pick up the phone and call a bureaucrat and say, look, I hear you've got this new program, I'd like to apply for it. Can you tell me what the rules are and what the guidelines are? That's lobbying. Not even an attempt to influence, just communicating. So a lot of people lobby and don't realize they're lobbying because lobbying is defined so broadly. There's 2 types of lobbyists principally. There's what we call consultants, which is when you go out and hire a firm like ours to help you find your way through government. And then there's what's called in-house lobbyists. So anybody who's an employee of a company who tries to influence government decisions or regularly communicates with government, they're considered what they call in-house lobbyists, and they also have to lobby. So I've had clients who have hired me. Obviously, they know I'm a lobbyist and I need to register. But then I turn back to them and say, well, you really need to register as well. Well, what do you mean? I'm not a lobbyist. I'm just the CEO of this company or the VP of public affairs for this company. And but you're an in-house lobbyist. There's a threshold. So if you just make one phone call, don't panic. You don't necessarily need to register on an in-house basis. Consultants must register no matter how much work they do. In-house lobbyists, there's a threshold in terms of how regularly you interact with government before you have to register. But lobbyists are anybody that deals with government. Finally, there's a whole regulatory system over that. So there's a commissioner of lobbying federally. Their sole job is to oversee the lobbying system. Provincially, we have an integrity commissioner who has a variety of responsibilities, but one of them is the Lobbyist Registration Act. So it's very policed, it's very transparent. Everybody, as I mentioned, all this threshold for registering, if you register, that's public. And every province has a registration regime. The federal government does, and large municipalities do as well. Not here in New Brunswick, but like Toronto, for example, would have a distinct lobbyist registration system. So if you were dealing in Ontario, you might have to register 3 times, federally, provincially, and municipally. Government is a big machine. So much so that there's a term that's used called machinery of government. And how government works, how government makes decisions, the process that those go through is called machinery of government. And a lot of people don't understand that machine. It's complex, and as the slide says, it's cumbersome and redundant. So the decision-making path, it usually goes up and then over, if you will. So you might have a project officer or a policy officer in a department that writes out, here's the background of this issue, and this is why we need to make a decision on it, and here are the different things we've considered, and here's the alternatives we looked at, but here's what we're going to recommend that we do. And that moves up a ladder in a hierarchical way that might make a little bit more sense to people from the private sector, where the person who's written that, their boss needs to sign off and their boss needs to sign off, and eventually it makes its way up to a decision maker. but lots of sideways steps in the middle of that. So the Executive Council Office provincially or the Privy Council Office federally is that central agency that coordinates decision making, and then things go to cabinet for decision. But before they go to cabinet, they usually go through cabinet committees. Before they get to cabinet committees, the central agencies need to take a look. So that policy officer that I described might write something, and then it would go to the director of policy in that department. Then the director of policy might send it over to a central agency to ask for people to take a look. There might be some changes. It might go back and forth. Then it would go up to the assistant deputy minister level, then to the deputy minister level. Deputy minister would sign off, the minister would sign off, but then it might go to a cabinet committee. Then it might go back to officials for changes and clarification, and then it might go to cabinet, and then it might be decided. And that can be a very robust process, a very long process. And for those who are used to the business world, it's a very different process. And so one of the things that we can do, and one of the things we describe ourselves as when we're explaining what we do to clients, is yes, anybody can pick up the phone and call the minister and try to influence the minister. That's not necessarily a very good strategy. Ministers are very busy. They might have 20 meetings a day, starting from 8 in the morning to late at night. And you might have a great meeting with the minister at 10 o'clock in the morning and walk out of there thinking you've got it all set. Well, then the minister immediately goes to his next meeting or her next meeting. And by the end of the day, they hardly remember they met you. And so that follow-up is important. And so we talk about a multi-front war in government relations, and the strategy. Here's the big value probably of this presentation in terms of advice that I always give our clients is you should never call a minister as the first call, because the first thing a minister does is ask for a briefing note. And this policy officer that I described earlier is going to write that briefing note. And they're going to write that based on whatever information they might have. And then that's going to go to the minister, and the entire context that the minister has when they go to the meeting with you is going to be based on that briefing note. So the first person you should call should be the person who will write the briefing note. And you brief them and you talk to them about your issue. You give them the understanding, you give them all the background information you have. And then you ask for a meeting with the minister, and all of a sudden the briefing note is very different, and it's much more sympathetic to your cause because you've educated the person that's going to write that briefing note before they write it. And so that's the sort of thing we do. We would say, okay, we're going to go talk to this person because they're going to write the briefing note. We're going to go talk to these people. And you might be talking about a health issue, and I say health because we do a lot of work with the Department of Health these days on the pandemic and on different rules and restrictions for clients. That's almost behind us, as John mentions. We're in phase 2 of 3 in the road to green now. But you might say, okay, well, we're going to actually go talk to the Minister of Education. And, well, why would you do that? This is a health issue, it's not an education issue. But yes, but it's going to go to the COVID-19 Cabinet Committee. A variety of people on that, including the Minister of Education, is very influential. So we want to make sure that the Minister of Education doesn't shoot this down when it goes to Cabinet. And so that multi-front war is something that's really important in government relations. So that's my long, boring political science seminar. And I apologize for that. I tried to do it a little bit quickly so it wouldn't be too boring. And I'll go back to John, and I don't know if there are questions or comments that folks have, but I'd be happy to take them in English ou en français.
Thank you, Jordan. Merci. It is now time for the Q&A portion of this morning's presentation. So please pose your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. C'est maintenant le moment pour le prochain question-réponse. S'il vous plaît, posez vos questions à l'aide de la fonction QA au bas de votre écran Zoom. And I see one popping in here. Oh, somebody asked, how do we find these policy officers? Is there a list? That person who's going to write that briefing note, Jordan?
Yes and no. So there is a feature on the government website. Most governments in Canada have it. Sometimes it's referred to as a directory, sometimes a contacts page where you can see all of the people in government. And so, I mean, just for illustrative purposes, I could pull that up here on the government website. It's very straightforward, but if you were to go to the government website, there's this contacts button up here, and then you can type in somebody's name, but you can also just choose a department. So we were talking about health, so you choose health, and you click on structure, and here's kind of the structure of the government. So here's your policy branch. In this context, it's called policy and legislation, and you can see all the employees there. So you would have a director, but also a bunch of policy advisors. So the answer to that question is, this is about as close as you can get. Which one of these dozen or so people would get assigned the file at the Department of Health? I couldn't tell you. So you'd call the director, say, look, I'm talking about this issue. Can I speak to you, or can I speak to one of your officials? And they would set you out. So that would be how you would find those people, is in that context.
Thank you. Next question. Do the rules that you just outlined also apply for not-for-profits?
Yes, it does. So the example actually that I often give is the Legion in Oaktown wants to apply for an energy efficiency grant to change the windows and maybe get a heat pump. If they're going to spend a lot of time talking to government officials about doing that, they would need to register. The threshold for not-for-profits, as I mentioned, or any kind of non-consultant lobbyist. So if you go out and hire a company like our company to talk to government on your behalf, we need to register immediately before we can make any communication with government. Businesses, not-for-profits, organizations, there's a 20% rule. So if it's 20% of one person's time, or if you're a bigger organization than multiple people talking to government, the equivalent of one person's time. So if John spends 5 hours a week, that's not 20%. But if John spends 5 hours a week, and Sally spends 3 hours a week, and Joe spends 2 hours a week, well, all of a sudden that's 10 out of 40 hours. That is 20%, and they would need to register. As an organization, the threshold is 20% of the equivalent of one person's time is spent talking to government. You have to register.
Okay. The next question brought a smile to me, especially knowing who posed it, but it's a bit of a fun one. What are the biggest challenges in dealing with politicians? You're able to say in this public forum.
Yeah, that's right. I need to answer that very, very carefully in mixed company. It can vary. It depends on the politician. And we've all seen that, even if we just watch the evening news. Not all politicians are cut from the same mold. So you've got politicians that are much more hands-on, and they may have a preconceived notion, and that can be a challenge. But you also have politicians that are very, very hands-off. And so they might not know their file. They might sort of know the file, but aren't really interested in getting into the weeds and are going to totally defer to their officials. And sometimes it can be the reverse. You can have aloof kind of politicians, and so you work a file through the bureaucracy, but then it gets the politician just torpedoes it. And so I guess the answer to that is it really depends on the politician, and that's one of the biggest and most important parts of your lobbying strategy. If you need to influence government, is to understand which politicians are going to be involved in the decision, and which ones are going to weigh in which way and at which point in the process, and how and when you should talk to them. And the answer would be almost entirely different for every politician you might encounter. They're all different beasts.
I'm sure there are certain politicians who are perhaps more approachable, or you develop a relationship over time, and it's a way into government.
It is, for sure. But I mean, one of the biggest mistakes that people make, I don't need to have a lobbying strategy because I know the minister. And it's very unusual that you can solve a problem just by talking to a minister, because And that's not a slight or a comment against the caliber of ministers or the work that they do. They're very, very busy, and there's a big machine underneath of them. And it's a very rare occasion that a minister is going to have the time to wrap their arms around an issue and drive it through that machine.
The next question, I think I can answer myself, but I'll pose it to you too. It's asked, would the Chamber of Commerce, which does a lot of lobbying, need a permit or be registered as a lobbyist? And I'll say up front that we are registered with the Integrity Commissioner here provincially.
And I presume that's because you need to be. So that's the answer to Yee's question.
Yeah. Next question is a very interesting one. It says, when undertaking a letter writing campaign, is it more effective to keep the copy list tight, or should you spread it to as many MLAs and people in government as possible?
Yes. Is that a good answer to that? So my advice would always be, form letters are ineffective, and so therefore a big CC list can be problematic, in that the volume of email is massive. These ministers, some of them don't even have the publicly listed email address that you can find. Some of that goes to people directly, but most ministers, it just goes to an admin person. They have a different email address. And these big, clearly, form letter based letter writing campaigns, often nobody sees them. They just go into an abyss, and there's a response, but it's a canned response. So I always advise clients when they're doing a letter writing campaign to give people guidance on what kind of a letter they would send, but for it to be customized. And so if Minister X receives 20 form letters that are exactly the same, that's going to be treated very differently than 20 different letters, different emails on the same subject matter with the same argument, but formed a little bit differently. And that's hard to orchestrate because people don't want to write their own. They'd rather cut and paste a form letter. But I would say your most effective letter writing campaign is one where each letter is kind of customized and a little bit different.
Would you recommend, after sending off a letter, to follow up with a phone call just to confirm receipt and next steps and sort of put the ball back in government's court?
Yeah, definitely. And that kind of jumps off from my last point. Like, a form letter isn't going to elicit, and even an individual letter isn't going to elicit the same kind of thinking in response as a meeting request. So I wouldn't just call and follow up and say, did you receive my letter? I would say, and could I have a meeting with the minister, or a meeting with the deputy minister, or whoever? Because meetings, and government people have a lot of meetings. Some people make a living just having meetings all day. But meetings cause things to happen. Like, before there's a meeting, usually there's a briefing note. After there's a meeting, usually there's some kind of an action item taken. And so meeting requests, even if you're not given the meeting, the act of requesting the meeting can cause thinking and work to occur about your issue. So meeting requests are a powerful tool.
Mm-hmm. Follow-up question on that one. The question says, you mentioned follow-up after the meeting with the minister. Can you talk more about what kind of follow-up to do? Is it a request for a meeting, the best way or only way, or are there other options?
It's really important to have a clear ask. We talk about an ask when you talk to government. When you go into a meeting with a government official, and this happens all the time, where people come out of a meeting and, oh, that was great, the minister was so friendly, she took notes, she seemed really engaged, or he did, as the case may be, and oh, that was wonderful, and yada, yada, yada. And, well, what did you ask them to do for you? Well, I just was trying to inform them on the issue, and maybe that's okay, because maybe you just want them to be aware when it comes up in a discussion, but usually you want to have an ask. And so, I want $650,000 to invest in this tourism initiative in Hillsborough? That's your ask. So say that. Like, don't be shy. Don't beat around the bush. Go in with a clear ask. Put it in writing. It's very good to put it in writing before, during, and after the meeting. And if the minister makes any kind of a commitment, this is a really good follow-up. If the minister says something and commits to something in a meeting, that has a lot of power in the machine of government. And so you go back with an email to the minister or to the minister's officials or staff and say, oh, it was great to have had that meeting yesterday. I was very pleased that the minister committed that within a month, the department will get back to us on our request for $650,000 to invest in this tourism initiative in Hillsborough. Looking forward to hearing your response. Like a very clear ask with a very clear description of any commitment that you may have gotten. That's the best way to follow up.
I want to give you an example that we're working on right now at the chamber. We're trying to strike a community task force on homelessness and downtown security, which is a big issue here in Moncton. And we're looking for 5 co-chairs of this task force, one to represent federal government, provincial government, municipal government, business community, and the social sector. So we've managed to get the other 4 co-chairs identified, leaving only the province to step up. So my approach today is to say, okay, the other 4 groups have identified someone and they're prominent people. So your play. And I'm hoping that will elicit the type of response we're looking for. Next question is, before even contacting the policy branch to start a discussion, what should we have prepared to ensure we can do a quick follow-up and keep things moving forward?
That's a very important question. And I would speak again to this notion of a clear ask. Like, if you're meeting the government, there must be a reason why, and make sure you make that very clear to them. The other thing is, if you want to give them background information, we talk a lot about one-pagers, and those are a powerful tool, and they should be 1 page long. It was one of my favorite jokes when I was first in the lobbying sector, is when you'd receive a 1-pager that was 7 pages long. Well, it's not a 1-pager; it's a 7-pager. And so, as I mentioned, these ministers, they're jammed. Like a good minister is having his or her first meeting at 7 o'clock, and they're going to 10 o'clock at night, and they're meeting. And so, if you want them to really read something and pay attention to it, it's got to be short and it's got to be snappy and to the point. So whether it's a 1-pager or it's a slideshow or deck, we call it, that you're going to present, it should be short and to the point. Like you don't go in with a 25-page PowerPoint that's wall after wall of text. You need to boil it down to a very, very, very effective message. And that applies to when you're talking to a minister, and when you're talking to a deputy minister or assistant deputy minister. You might need more information and more detail for that policy officer who wants to understand the issue and needs to understand the issue to create their own 1-pager to brief a minister or a deputy minister. So we have briefing notes, which hopefully are brief, and those are all kind of informed by broader context. But I think you need to have that level of detail in your back pocket if you're asked for it. But as a general rule, you want to go in with a very, very succinct ask.
Jordan, in a traditional 4-year arc of a majority government, is there a time when lobbying is more effective? And I'm asking that question in the context of the likelihood of a federal election this fall.
Yeah, I think before is a very effective time. Opposition parties in particular can be very much influenced in a pre-election period in terms of what they might put in their platform, what they might say about an issue. Incumbents less so, because they often are relying on stuff they've already been working on and they want to finish. So it's less organic. But opposition parties, you can really influence what they might put in their platform. And I'm sure people generally would be fairly cynical about political parties and their platforms and what they put in them. But you would be shocked when I talk about the machinery of government, how much currency that platform has. Like bureaucrats feel that their primary obligation almost when a government comes in is to help them implement their platform. And so when a government takes office, the first day after the election, when they walk in, even before they've been sworn in, those bureaucrats spent that whole election period writing briefing notes on everything that every party promised. So the parties that don't win, those briefing notes go to the shredder, and the rest of them go into a book. And when the new government comes into the office, there's a book saying, okay, here's what you promised in your platform. Well, platform commitments are, a sentence, maybe they're a news release, a paragraph. There's not a lot of detail there. So the bureaucrats will have prepared, okay, you promised that you're going to reduce wait times by 10%. Here's a 40-page memo on different ways you could reduce wait times by 10%. Where do you want to go with that? And so that kind of pre-election period is very important because you get things into the platform. The system, it has a whole machine around implementing that platform. It is so much easier. Sometimes it's very frustrating when you're in government because the machine is big and it's cumbersome and you decide, oh, I want to do this thing. You can bang your head against the wall for months or years, even if you're the Premier of New Brunswick or the Prime Minister of Canada trying to do that thing. If it's in the platform, it's different. The machine is predisposed to do it. They know they have to do it. So the whole kind of creating momentum in the machine process is eliminated because it's created by that platform commitment. So that pre-campaign thing, as you mentioned, John, we've likely got a federal election here in 2 or 3 months' time, is valuable. And then there's different cycles, I guess, to answer the question. Pre-budget, pre-throne speech are great times because those are the next best thing to a platform. If something is said in the throne speech, the machine is going to try to do it. If something is said in a budget, the machine is going to try to do it. And so if you can get things into throne speeches, budgets, platforms, it makes your job a lot easier. And if you can't, then there's other processes. And certainly early is a good time because it gives them enough runway to get it to happen. And late is a good time because governments always go in the mad dash before an election to figure out, oh, well, what do I need to do to get reelected? Who do I need to like me? Who do I need to, which issues do I need to resolve? So early and late is good. And the other thing I would throw out, if it's financial, March is a great time, February, March, because the fiscal year ends on March 31st and departments that have money left on the table, that money just goes away on March 31st. So there's often a lot more propensity to spend in February, March than there is in April or May.
Time for a couple more questions. Somebody's asked, between the minister and deputy minister, who is the best person to speak to if you are registered as a lobbyist?
I think it kind of depends, not to cheap out on that answer, but as a general rule, I would say the deputy minister, but it's not always the case. I mean, it depends on the type of issue, how political it is. If you get a real strong argument to make, and government has just missed something or screwed something up, the deputy minister is the right person to talk to. If it's more of you're trying to appeal to somebody's heart or reason, and it's less cut and dry, you just want to, convince somebody, that this is the right thing to do, then it's probably the minister. But it can depend on who the minister is and who the deputy minister is. Deputy ministers are usually not subject matter experts. Sometimes they are, but for example, not to keep going back to health, but the deputy minister of health, who some folks might know, he spent most of his career in the Southeast. Gerald Richard is his name. He's a school teacher who went up the ranks of the school system, became director general of the school district in Kent County. It was before the school districts were all merged, and then he became assistant deputy minister of education, and then he became deputy minister of education. And then once you become deputy minister, it's like ministers. We all talk about cabinet shuffles, but there's deputy minister shuffles all the time. So after, 30 years in the education system, he became Deputy Minister of Health because the skill set they're looking for in a deputy minister is an able kind of administrator of the civil service, not an expert in the subject matter that they're managing. The subject matter is management. And so I say that just to say that sometimes you might have deputy ministers that are subject matter experts. So if you had a physician who was deputy minister of health, my advice on who you talk to would be different than if you had a school teacher who was deputy minister of health.
Quick question here. Do you think there's value in, as a private citizen, for instance, going to a public event where there's a politician, there's a minister, and trying to ask a question spontaneously?
There definitely can be. I mean, less so in New Brunswick and provincially than you might federally, because ministers are pretty accessible in New Brunswick. It's not hard to get a meeting with a minister, whereas it would be virtually impossible to get a meeting with a federal cabinet minister. So, but that follow-up piece is really important. Like if you meet Minister so-and-so at the Moncton Chamber meet and greet at the Press Club, you want to send an email to the minister's office the next day and say, oh, it was really great to meet you, Minister. I was glad that we were able to talk about X. And I was able to say to you, that our clear ask is this clear ask, and would really look forward to talking to you again or to your officials about that. That will generate that whole process. That email will get responded to, and the machine will have to write a response, which will cause people to study your issue and write a briefing note and so on and so forth. So it's not a bad entry point to cause that work to happen, but don't just go and talk to that minister at the meet and greet and then think you've done your work. That's just at the beginning of your work.
I wanted to sneak in one last question of my own, and that's about the power of social media to influence policy. Do politicians and their deputies pay a lot of attention to what's being said on social media?
Yeah, if they're good, they do. And so and it's still in its infancy, ironically. I mean, the government is always a little slow, even though we've all been on social media for 15 years. It's still new. And so there's a whole system around traditional media, clippings and briefings every day on what was in the paper, what was on the radio, what was on the TV news. And more, there's a summary of what's going on in social media, but also, I mean, these politicians are all on social media. So if they see that 30 people in their feed have shared something about issue X, they're probably going to go to their deputy minister and say, what the heck is going on with this issue? It's all over my Facebook. So there's definitely some value there for sure. Okay.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. We've taken up close to a full hour. So thanks very much to Jordan O'Brien and Christine McGrath of Jordan O'Brien for helping shed some light on the mysteries of working with and lobbying government. And we could talk, I'm a political geek as well, Jordan. I could talk about this stuff all day. Before we close today's session, I just want to mention our next Breakfast and Learn session will be on the topic of accessing the value of experiential learning. It'll be held on June 23rd. And on July 7th, we'll explore the world of artificial intelligence and another Breakfast and Learn. I also want to put a plug in, and Jordan already did it for me, our annual Chamber Golf Tournament to be held August the 19th at Royal Oaks. And I checked yesterday, and we have close to 90 players registered now, 2 months out. So I would, if you're interested in playing, I would get your name in there soon, because we will cap it at 144 players. And also a note that nominations for annual Business Excellence Awards are now open. There's a simple nomination form on our website where you can nominate your own company or another company in the business community. And the deadline for nominations is the end of June. So with that, thanks again very much, Jordan. Great conversation. Thanks, Christine from Jordan O'Brien. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Merci de vous être rejoints à nous. Stay safe. Get that second vaccine dose. I'm getting my second dose today. And we hope to see you all again real soon. Bye for now.